On March 22, 2023, the Canada School of Public Service launched the Economic Security in an Era of Global Disruption event series. The inaugural event, titled The Shifting Dynamics of Global Power, explored how geopolitics, technology, and climate change are shifting the balance of international economic power. Speakers Yves Tiberghien, Olivia Lazard, and Malcolm Brown spoke to how nation-states are increasingly weaponizing trade, acquiring new technology and intellectual property, seeking dominance in the emerging green economy, and altering and eroding international governance structures.
So we're living through great change. Since 2008, 2009, especially since 2016-17, we have entered a period of structural disruptions and major contestation for the future of the liberal international order, or the rules-based international order, as we like to call it in Canada. Several major changes or disruptions are occurring at the same time. The net result is that all actors in the global system are going through major adjustments and jockeying for influence. The future rules of the global order are up for grabs. For a country like Canada, it's essential to respond to these shocks. One of the key cognitive biases for humans is the assumption that tomorrow will be the same as today, and next year the same as last year. It's particularly important to overcome this bias in a period of powerful disruptions and intensified geopolitics. We're going through not one, but two great industrial revolutions: the digital AI revolution and the green technology revolution. These two revolutions will change the economy fundamentally within the next 2 decades. So by the late 2030s, the future economic prosperity of nations, including Canada, and the ranking of countries will change. It's basically up for grabs based on who does what in those two industrial revolutions. Industrial revolutions reset the economy and reset the winners and losers. Essentially, we have separated economy and security since 1945. And we have built liberal economic order. And the idea was trade is out of security. We tried to avoid what was done in the 19th century, where trade was used for security purposes or for imperialism, and to build a public good-oriented system. And then security is a tough game. It's always a zero-sum game, and we treat that separately. And what we discover is in the period of disruption where we are, and geopolitical change and competition and confrontation, elements of the economy are now being securitized. So they enter under the field of security. And so that intersection of the two fields is national economic security. And it requires, and it's difficult to do because in a way, we don't want the whole global economic system to crash like the 1930s. In a way, this is the end of a stable rules-based order. This is the end of linear thinking and predictable behavior and institutions. The global order is partially up for grabs. And so we can expect that day after day, months after months, we will see major changes, major shocks, major crises that will come at us faster than what we're used to. And that requires resetting our assumptions and, in a way, our models and institutions. So we tend to expect a lot of the UN, but the UN's effectiveness is completely a function of the degree of agreement among the 5 veto powers of the UN Security Council. In other words, when the dominant states, what we call systemically important states, don't agree, global institutions can't work very well. I'm struck when I talk to students from Africa or from Southeast Asia or from Central Asia, that those rising young elites from the global South, they have powerful voice now. And they want to regain voices very proud in their ancient cultures, voices that were lost in the colonial era. They think the end, this is the end of a purely G7 club. They want to be part of the table. And it's crucial to pay attention to the new thinking and new behavior of all those global South elites beyond China. I actually think China is going to be a big problem for 2-3 decades. But beyond that, we're going to have many other major global South players, and we will also need to have a system that works with them.
Actors in the global South, as Yves was saying, are now the agents of change. They are the agents of change because they are the arbiters of systems rivalry and transition issues. They do not align with any sense of ideology. The notion of democracy versus authoritarianism does not resonate at all. They pursue their own self-empowerment on their own terms. This is about acknowledging essentially that we are now in an era of polycentric distribution of power, which is interestingly something that Russia has very well identified in its national documents already 10 years ago, and that it wants to generate, it wants to generate tensions that are the polycentric distribution of power. But the key part about actors in the global south, which are incredibly diverse, is that they're not norms takers anymore. They are norms challengers in their own right, to the extent that norms have failed their own interests in terms of economic development, in terms of stabilization, in terms of breaking free from debt burdens, and trying, well, essentially sort of reaping the costs of an international rules-based order that has been filled with inconsistencies that have built up over time.
Canada must stop assuming that it can always rely on institutions of the rules-based international order when large powers stop following the rules and they act strategically. Some sectors have become more strategic, and some actors stop assuming that they can rely on self-regulating markets. Things like critical minerals, lithium, semiconductors, digital and AI, green tech increasingly are not functioning like markets anymore. They become strategic sectors. The speed of conversion of various actors varies, but there is a wave of industrial policy tools being deployed. Canada and others have a stake in maintaining the stability of the system, but they must also identify areas that have become weaponized and learn to push back, as well as identify areas where industrial policy tools can secure a better position for Canada. The question becomes where to defend the order with like-minded partners and allies, and where to secure national interest to ensure a key position for Canada in the global value chain.
So the model of interdependency is not just being weaponized, within systems rivals. It's also being weaponized, it's being weakened, not weaponized, within old alliances as a result of this systems rivalry, which is pushing in different directions. And the difficulty in that is obviously that the systems rivals, particularly in that case, we're talking about Russia and China, are intent on making sure that they press on the fragilities inside of all the alliances that have supported the rules-based order at international levels. And they're trying to essentially weaken this arc of alliances that, in their view, constrain their power, their forms of political and economic organizations, and the way in which they organize themselves, in terms of societies. So they tap into disruptions that pre-exist in terms of fragilities at home, but they also try to sow the seeds of more and more fragility. And they are intent in doing so on showing how hollow open societies and democracies are, even if it means that they're essentially using misinformation and disinformation to try and sow a lot of doubt about the credibility, the integrity, and the legitimacy of democratic systems, transparent and accountable systems. If we look, for example, at Russia and China, they are currently showing an image of being profound, ideologically aligned partners, et cetera, but it's actually a partnership of convenience. And what's interesting about this, and it tells you something about the long-term view of China and its ability to stomach costs, is that it has been able to turn what the West considered as economic externalities in terms of social, environment, and economic costs. It has been able to stomach those for decades until it could turn the tables around and instrumentalize the West's blind spots. It was able to take in sunken costs in terms of its own political economy. When you look, for example, at the fundamental damage, ecological damages where rare earths have been extracted, it shows you essentially that China is able to accept a fairly strong level of disruption or costs in order to rise to power. So this willingness to accept sunken costs on the way to the generation of power and the reproduction of power is a pattern at the heart of how China projects its own, political form of power.
Well, it's actually a great time for middle powers. It's because middle powers are the critical engines, innovation, catalysts, etc., conveners, arbitrageurs, etc., that we need in this time of great uncertainty. And we just saw one. We saw Indonesia chairing the G20 in a brilliant way. So I think this is time for being super entrepreneurial and having Canada really wake up to that role. But it's going to be a complex role because it's doing different things at the same time. So we have to be more flexible, more pragmatic. We obviously need to still invest in some remaining global pillars that are critical for planetary survival and for maintaining a global economy that we don't want it to crash like the 1930s. We need to work on security with allies, and probably as part of that, together with allies, because our security in Canada is a relational security. It's not, we don't do it on our own. Canada will probably need to step up in certain domains more. So that's one component. We need to work on new pillars that are critical in the green space, the digital space, the AI space, and that will require going beyond G7 partners. We can't just stay with the small piece there. We're going to have to work with rising global SaaS partners, and that requires having great working relationship with India, with Indonesia, with after the war, Ethiopia was a rising country for 10 years, and so on, right? And Chile, and now Brazil. And so we need to be much more innovative, engage all those new players, and any proposal that's coming from a country like Canada with great reputation and say Indonesia and India or 3 countries will have much more resonance than just a proposal coming out of Canada and Australia, for example. So we need to create those new, and I agree with what Olivia said earlier, part of affirming the national interest of Canada and as well maintaining the rules-based order is to really work in that polycentric world and to counter the space that has been left to China and Russia for so long, right? In a way that's helpful to the global South countries, treating them as equal partners, but creating things with them. And so there's so much more to do there.
I think there's a risk of people thinking that Canada can play its traditional role, the role it liked to think it played in the post-Bretton Woods world, where we were aligned with the new emerging Bretton Woods order. We had the benefit of alignment with the US, but we played a constructive role internationally, the middle power role that we like to brag about as a country in our mythology. I would posit that the environment's going to be much more challenging. It's not just simply reprising that role. And that's mythology. We actually need to realize we're going to have to make choices that are much more difficult than Canada choosing not to support the war in Vietnam militarily the way Australia did, but much more challenging environment with, look how we struggled with Huawei as an example. And so I posit to you that you've been quite positive about the role Canada can play, middle powers, but it's actually going to be a much more challenging environment.
The Canada School of Public Service hosts exciting and insightful events, workshops, and courses on geopolitics and national security. To learn more, contact the following email address.